My name is Ashley Kolb, and I'm an elementary science curriculum specialist for the Houston Independent School District. I'm very excited to bring you another week of Houston ISD at Home Science lessons. So today's lesson is a lesson for 3rd through 5th grade students, although anyone can follow along, and it's over adaptations. Our objective for today is to identify plant and animal adaptations in an ecosystem. So the materials that you will need to do this for today are just a pencil or something to write with, and either a sheet of paper or a notebook or something to write on. So this week we're going back to the pond, and Remy the frog has a new adventure to talk to you about. Okay. So today's story is called Remy Feels Ugly. So in the last story, remember the pond had gotten really in bad shape because the sun had left. So now that the sun is back, and once the pond was back to its beauty, Remy enjoyed her daily activities at the pond, hopping and hopping between lily ponds and talking to her friends. Until one night, after admiring the sky and the attractive and colorful animals that live in the pond, she felt tired and she went to sleep. Going to sleep. Laying on her lily pond bed, she sighed and thought, I wish I could have the same beautiful colors on my skin that Mr. Fishy's scales have. Suddenly her skin was looking bright and full of scales. Enchanting colors covered all over her body. Immediately she started to feel breathless and dry. What do you think is happening? I wonder, why do you think she's starting to feel dry and breathless with her scales? The scales were covering her body, and she couldn't breathe since frogs perform most of their respiration through the skin, and the scales couldn't absorb water to keep Remy's moist skin. Oh, how she wished to have her own skin back. So they were pretty scales, but they didn't help her skin. See what she does next. While she was trying to get back to normal, a little squirrel was drinking water from the pond, observing her lovely image on the water. Remy admired her pretty almond-shaped eyes and wished she could have such gorgeous eyes. In a zap, Remy's eyes were changing. Now Remy had almond-shaped eyes just like the squirrel. As soon as this transition happened, Remy started to be concerned when she noticed that she couldn't see predators like snakes, lizards, or even birds. She would also struggle to eat. What do you think is happening? Well, Remy's eyes are adapted to be on top of her head so she can have vision of her surroundings, and the eye structure help her gulp her food. Even though her eyes looked lovely, oh, how she wished to have her own eyes back. So even though the squirrel eyes were pretty, they didn't really help her when it was time to stay away from predators to catch food. And we talked about the word adapted in there. We'll learn more about this word. While she was trying to get her eyes back to normal, some mosquitoes passed by. Remy observed them, how they were enjoying the tasteful and delicious nectar of the flowers. So she thought, I wish I could have a tiny fine proboscis instead of this big mouth. As soon as she said this, she saw her reflection on the water and noticed a tiny, fine, long mouth. Later, she started feeling hungry and she wished to eat a big, fat fly. She loved them. They were so tender, juicy, and soft. She ran happily with her new mouth and tried to catch one, but what do you think is happening now? Well, she couldn't catch the fly because Remy's mouth is already adapted to capture big insects and trap them with her tongue. With this tiny, fine proboscis, not even her tongue could get it out. How much she wished to have her big mouth back. So her tongue wouldn't come out of the proboscis. She couldn't catch her food. Sounded cool for a little bit, but not anymore. And we saw that word adapted again. While she was trying to get her mouth back, Mrs. Ducky came to say hello. Remy saw her neighbor's graceful silhouette. Her feet were even and attractive, not like hers with short in the front and long in the back. Remy thought, I wish I could have Mrs. Ducky's feet, short and well-rounded. As soon as she wished for this, she noticed her body changing again. Abruptly, in the silence of the pond, she heard a slithering sound. It was a snake, looking at her with hungry eyes. The snake was trying to eat her. She tried to jump to save herself from this horrendous creature, but she couldn't jump. The function of the back legs is to help frogs jump high enough to keep them safe. As she was trying to escape, she said, "Oh, how much I wish to have my long legs back." So she couldn't get away from her predators. And we talked about the word function, the function of her feet. While she was trying to get her long legs back, she felt she needed to have a safer house. Looking around, she saw a snail with a beautiful patterned shell. She said to herself, "That's it. That's the house I need." Wishing to have a shell for a house, she started feeling something heavy on top of her. It was a colorful yellowish shell. She was feeling happy with her new house until she tried to move. She could barely move around. The house was big and heavy. She couldn't jump. She couldn't swim. She could only drag herself on the ground. She was exhausted and thought, "Oh, how much I wish to be floating on my lily leaves again." It wasn't the right house. Okay. Mrs. Ducky was calling her ducklings with a loud quacking sound when Remy opened her eyes. It was all a dream. She looked at her reflection on the water and realized how lucky she was that her structures are adapted to the environment where she lives. She thought she was the most beautiful frog in the pond. So we talked about structures, and we also talked about environment, which is a word we talked about a little bit last time too. So we've got Remy and her structures and her environment. So in a few minutes, we're going to learn more about how this story with Remy and the different types of animal parts that Remy dreamed of having, how that has to do with our pond ecosystem and the animals that live in a pond. Before we start that part, I want to go over our cognitive content dictionary with you. So the word we're going to focus on and learn more about today is the word adaptation. Excuse me. So we're going to learn more about this word adaptation. So if you recall, after we put our word here, we have to predict what we think that word means. So where have you heard the word adaptation before? Maybe you've heard it in science already and you can predict what it means here. Maybe you haven't heard it in science yet. Maybe you've heard people say like adapting to a change, or something about, I don't know, like that's how we adapt. So that's kind of how I've heard the word outside of science. So I want you to think of a prediction to add to your cognitive content dictionary. And I'm going to think of one for mine. All right, so I'm going to put here that I think, since I've learned about adaptation when it comes to change or getting used to something, I'm going to write that I think adaptation means to change or to fit in. Because I've heard adapt to your surroundings, or if things aren't going well, try adapting to it. So I'm going to leave this as my word and my definition, or my prediction. And when we come back later, after we've done our lesson, we'll get into the definition of that word, and we'll also write an oral sentence once we've learned more about what adaptation means in science. Last week, you may remember us taking some time to look at this pond ecosystem. So I've put this picture of our pond ecosystem back up. And you might remember us adding the sun to this ecosystem. We talked about how the sun has the energy to start everything else in this ecosystem and how the sun is the most important piece. And we talked about food chains and we talked about food webs and what all the different animals in here get their energy from, and the plants as well. So we're going to take that a step further this week, and we're going to specifically talk about these different organisms and what structures they have that help them survive here. So take a second and look at this pond ecosystem. I want you to think about what are some things that are important for organisms to be able to do to live in this ecosystem. So I see water here. So the animals that interact with the water have to be able to either live and breathe underwater, or they have to be able to swim across the water. So they have different structures that help them do that. Or I see a lot of green plants and how a lot of them are tall. So they have to be tall in order to shoot up out of the water and get their energy from the sun. And the ones that live in the water have to have special things too. So I've found a few of the different organisms in this ecosystem. I'll move you a little bit this way. So I found some different organisms in this ecosystem, and we're going to talk about different structures they have. And we're going to decide and play a matching game together to match the function to the structure. So here are the different structures we have. We have the fins of a fish. We have the water lily's leaves. We have the frog's long tongue, which we talked about with Remy, right? We have duck's webbed feet. We have frog's legs. We have a mosquito's long mouth, which we also call a proboscis. And we talked a little bit last week about that proboscis and how it helps it eat flowers or suck blood, or when I say eat flowers, get the nectar out of the flowers. We have the snail's shell and the dragonfly's long body. So I'm going to show you one of these different cards at a time. And these cards have functions, and each of these functions matches one of these structures. So I'm going to have you guys help me figure out where each of these goes and which one it matches with. So here's our first one. Gives the organism the ability to jump long and high from pad to pad. So which of these structures here do you think matches this function? Being able to jump long and high from pad to pad. Well, especially because I see it happening here, I think it's our frog's legs. I'm going to go with that one. So the structure is the frog leg, and the function is being able to jump long and high from pad to pad. Okay, here's the next one. Allows the organism to catch high-flying insects for food. Where do you think that would go here? I think we had two frog pieces in a row, so I think that this structure, or this function, matches this structure here. So that frog's long tongue helps it catch high-flying insects for food. So we're going to match those. Okay. Allows the organism to suck nectar from flowers and for females to suck blood from other animals. I think I gave this one away a few minutes ago. So can you look at these and figure out which structure on an organism goes with this function? That's right. I think it is this proboscis, this long mouth on this mosquito. Okay. Here's the next one. Allows the organism to swim easily and quickly across the top of the water. So they're swimming on top of the water, and it allows them to go quickly and easily. So when I look at these and I'm looking at what's left, I'm trying to figure out what swims on top of the water. I think it's our duck here and his webbed feet. If you look here, you can see these ducks are along the top of the water. You can't really see their feet in this picture, but there are feet there. So I'm going to match this with our duck's webbed feet. Okay, we've got a few more to go. Y'all are doing great. Here's our next one. Float on water and allow the organism to take in more energy from the sun. Okay, so it floats on water and it gets its energy from the sun. So what kind of organisms get their energy from the sun? If you said plants or producers, you're right. So we only have one producer on here. Where's our producer on our chart? That's right, our water lily leaves right here. So those water lily leaves float on the water, and they are a structure that allows the plant to get more energy from the sun because it's flat and it floats across the top. All right, allows the organism to swim easily and quickly underwater. All right, so this time we're swimming underwater. I think that one might be up here, our fish fins. So those fins, the way they're designed, help that fish swim in water. Okay, two more. Y'all are doing great. Protects the organism from predators as it slowly moves throughout the ecosystem. So we've got our snail and our dragonfly left. So which one has a structure that protects it as it slowly moves? I agree, that's the snail shell right here. So right here, snail shell. And then our last one, let's read it to make sure we're right, because even though there's the last one here, sometimes when you're matching, you just want to put it right there, but let's make sure it makes sense before we just put it on our chart. Allows the organism to change directions quickly. So a dragonfly's long body. Would having a long body help you move quickly and change directions? I think so, I think it would. So we're gonna put that here with dragonfly. So before we move on, I want you to take a look at all of these structures that we talked about. So these are all structures from animals that live in our pond ecosystem. And looking at all of these structures and matching them with their functions, thinking about what we know about these organisms. So without these structures serving their special functions, would these animals be able to survive in this ecosystem? I don't know, it might be pretty difficult. And also, like we learned in our story with Remy earlier, sometimes specific structures help specific animals. So it wouldn't be good for all animals to have webbed feet. It wouldn't be good for all animals to have that structure of a shell, or for all plants to have that ability to float on top of water. What if it's a place that doesn't have a lot of water? Or a different kind of organism? Like, would this really help with something that has a proboscis, that trying to get nectar from it? So just lots of things to think about. So when we're talking about animals and what they have to help them survive in an environment, it's important to remember their structures and the functions of those structures.
Our objective today is to identify plant and animal adaptations in an ecosystem. So there's that word, adaptations, again, that we talked about earlier and put in our cognitive content dictionary. So here's the pond ecosystem that we have been looking at over these past couple of weeks worth of videos. So in the pond ecosystem, I want you to review the features of the ecosystem. So take a look at it for just a minute and think about what are the different parts, features, important things in this ecosystem. All right, so we know that there are lots of green plants surrounding the water, right? So that's one feature. Another feature is that there's lots of water and there's sand at the bottom. There's tall, like we mentioned the plants, but they're tall plants. There's creatures that fly, there's creatures that swim. So those are important features of this ecosystem. So we talked a little bit earlier about structures and functions, and we took a look at and did a matching activity with some structures and functions of organisms that live here. So I want you to think about what structures would organisms need to survive here? So if you're living in water, you have to have the ability to either walk or swim on top of the water, like our pond skaters and our ducks, or you have to have the ability to jump, like the frog on the water lilies. If you can't swim, you have to have the ability to fly over the top, like our mosquitoes and our dragonflies. And you have all these creatures living under the water that have special structures that help them do that as well. Also, our plants, if you look at this water lily, we talked about this earlier, the water lily starts way down at the bottom here and has to grow all the way up so its leaves can get sunlight at the top. The same thing with our duck potatoes. They're kind of long too and have these leaves that sprout up once they get to the top of the water. So any of these plants that live under the water, like we have some down here that are unnamed that live kind of these pond plants under the water. So any of these plants under the water would have to have special adaptations that allow them to still get energy from the sun and allow them to still grow even though they're not reaching the top of the water. So those are just some different structures that they would need to help them survive. So you might be asking exactly what is an adaptation, that word we keep bringing up over and over. So an adaptation is a particular structure that has a function that helps an organism meet its needs and live in a particular environment. So all that time we were talking about structures and functions, we didn't exactly name them as adaptations, but that's what they really were, the different structures that an organism has and that have some sort of function to help them meet their needs. So we talked about this frog image and how the frog has that long tongue to help it catch flying insects since it can't jump up as high and capture them just kind of snapping at them all the time. So the tongue is an adaptation because it's a structure that has a function that helps it meet its needs, and getting energy from insects is something that that frog needs. We also talked about the webbed feet on a duck, and so this is one that you guys saw earlier in our matching activity as well. So the webbed feet are the structure, and the function of those webbed feet is to help those birds swim in the water because they can't go under the water. We also talked about the water lilies and how the water lilies have those special leaves, and that structure of their leaves helps them float on top of the water so they're able to get the necessary sunlight and energy they need in order to make their own food as plants, as producers, if you might remember from last week. And then finally, on this page, we had way more whenever we talked in our lesson, but remember we talked about our snail, and that shell on the snail is a special structure that helps it stay protected. So it moves really slow and it needs some sort of protection to keep it from getting hunted by a predator or to keep it from getting too dried out if it's just crawling around without a lot of moisture. So we can organize all of the information that we've learned in a table. So I want you to draw this table in your notebook, and I want you to label one side organism and one side adaptation. Now I put structure and function in parentheses here because the structure and the function are both very important when we're talking about adaptations. So I gave you an example. We have our mosquito as an organism, and I mentioned female because we're talking about the structure of a straw-like mouth known as a proboscis that's used to suck blood. So I'll give you just a little bit of time to draw this table, and after the lesson is over, you can write it in your notebook and record 3 more adaptations. You can think back to earlier slides. You can think back to our matching activity. But I want you guys to be able to come up with some structures and functions from some of the different organisms. So some of those adaptations.
You all just had the opportunity to learn more about the term that we use for these structures that animals and plants have and the function that those structures serve. And we talked about how the structures and functions of those structures that an animal have are all of their adaptations. So remember this word from earlier. We talked about adaptations, and our prediction was that an adaptation was like a change or something to fit in. So now we know that an adaptation is a structure with a function to help an organism survive in an ecosystem. So your definition may look a little bit different from mine. They don't have to be exactly the same, but hopefully from all of the different things you learned about in your understand it portion, you got the idea that adaptations really have to do with these structures and functions. So over a long time, it's the way that animals have used their structures and have functions that go with these structures that help them survive. I don't think that I would be adapted or have the right adaptations to survive in a pond ecosystem, but I might have structures that I can start to think about how their functions could work one day. So that's all what it's about with our adaptations and and how the structures and the function of those structures work together to help that organism fit in its environment. And environments can change over time, which is where that change idea kind of comes into it. So it's not that we're completely wrong when we say it's a change, because organisms have to use their adaptations all the time. It's one of those things where if the environment changes, they have to have, their structures have to have functions that help them survive. So my oral sentence that I'm going to write today is going to use the word adaptation. So I want you to think of an oral sentence that you could write down, and I'm going to think of one that I can write. I think I'm going to write about our frog, going back to Remy. So I'm going to say a frog leg is an adaptation. I'm going to underline that word. That helps the frog jump in the pond. And you could write about any adaptations. You could add more than one sentence about adaptations if you wanted to. Okay, so here's what I'm going to leave you guys with today. Like I mentioned before, we have our structures and functions, and we talked about our pond ecosystem. What I'm going to ask you to do on your own in your notebooks after this lesson is to, remember we talked about the table during the Understand It. I want you to fill in that table with a couple of more plants and animals and what their adaptations are that help them survive here.
Another thing that I'd like for you to do is design your own animal and explain the structures and functions that it would need to survive in its ecosystem. On the screen right now, you see a template that you can use on a sheet of paper or your science notebook to help you complete this task. So first you would choose an ecosystem. Then you would create an animal that has 2 or 3 different structures. You draw the animal in an empty space on your sheet of paper, kind of like this green box on this document. And then you'd explain your structures and functions. So what are the structures and what functions do those structures have? I hope this is something that you can do and share with someone that you know.
Have a great day.